Permaculture is really a design system, and so it's not really a system of gardening or a system of farming in the way of precisely how you work the plants and the soil. It affects all of those things, but it's more of a design system for both sustainable land use in the broadest sense. That could be everything from gardening to forestry and grazing and everything in between, and sustainable living. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation, how we provide human needs from nature, and also the consumption side of the equation, how we use those resources and eventually the complete way we live. Yes, well, the origins of permaculture really are in what I call the first wave of modern environmentalism in the 1970s, where there was a huge ferment of interest in ideas in what we would call sustainability today. And it's sometimes difficult to explain to young people how strong that was in the 1970s, associated with the energy crises, but also right through to the beginnings of the counterculture of ideas of intentional community, organic agriculture, natural building, self-directed, more autonomous or more self-reliant ways of living. So I was all influenced by all of those ideas around me, and I was a student in 1974 in what I describe as the most radical experiment in tertiary education in Australia's history, a course called environmental design. And it was sort of a design profession course, architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning. And after the first year in that course, which was very free and very radical, there was no fixed curriculum, I'd come to the conclusion that my real interest in a profession sense was really around the field that we would call landscape architecture. But I was interested in how landscape architecture could be applied to agriculture using the principles from ecology. So the intersection between the design practice of landscape architecture, the agriculture as the primary way we provide for human needs, and the science, the holistic science of ecology. And as far as I could see, those three things did not come together at all. You could find intersections between two, but not between the three. And it was at that stage that I met Bil Molisăn, who really became my informal mentor outside of even the framework of this radical course. And between us, the idea, the kernel of the idea of permaculture emerged out of that very intense working relationship for a couple of years. And it was in that time that I penned the manuscript that became Permaculture 1, published in 1978. So for me, that was stuff that was coming out of academia in a way, out of conceptual stuff, but at the same time, Bill and I were developing the prototype permaculture garden at his property on the fringes of Hobart. So I was working constantly at the desk on this project, full-time, not doing anything else in my studies, and actually working, putting together these ideas in practice. So it was that synergy between the practical work and the theoretical. I've spoken about the design principles, which are very central to everything we do in permaculture, but there's a deeper foundation on which those 12 design principles rest, and that's the three ethics of permaculture. We don't see these as unique to permaculture, but they are a reinterpretation of basic ethical frameworks that can be seen in every traditional society on the planet in the past, and also in the various experiments and successes, in some case failures in others, of over the last 100 years to create intentional communities. They've all been underpinned by some ethical framework. So this distinguishes permaculture from simply design tools that we can use for good or ill, that we are obliged to understand them in terms of these three simple ethics of care of the earth, care of people, and fair share. Now, everyone's got their own interpretations of these ethics, and we can't say there is an exact, permaculture interpretation, because they're more questions that we are obliged to consider in everything we do than answers. But if we look at the first principle of care of the earth, modern people tend to think of that through the image of spaceship Earth and maybe the slightly image of the earth in hands. That is of some use, but it tends to overstate humans' power in guiding this 4 billion year old living earth, whereas we are really just a very small part of this system. I tend to think of care of the earth as being care of the earth under our feet, care of soil. Firstly, because that is something that we actually have the power to do something about. Some territory that we are responsible for, a piece of land, and that soil is arguably the deepest expression of the mystery of life, at least life out of its ocean origins to when life came out on the land. The first thing life did was create soil. And it's still the deepest mystery to science. It's really the core of the older environmental thinking that permaculture rests on, coming out of the organic movement, going back almost 100 years of this reverence for soil. And it really does determine, to a great extent, the fate of future generations is the condition of the soil. Now, there's all sorts of complex technical aspects behind that, and how we care for the soil is a complex and uncertain thing that we have to come back to. But that's one very simple, grounded way of what does care of the earth mean. Similarly, when we say care of people, sometimes people can assume, how do we care for the 6.5 billion people on the planet? I tend to interpret it as care of the self, kin and community. Again, some territory that you have some responsibility and some power to influence. Because especially for the billion or so middle class people on the planet, who are the engine of global destruction, more so than the 5 billion poorer people, and more so than the elite, who are so few in number that they don't really make much direct impact. That the billion or so middle class people on the planet, through not dealing with their own internal genuine needs, the need to belong, the need to look after oneself and others around one, leads to this consumption acquisitive economy that is driven by advertising, propaganda and other things. So when we look after ourselves genuinely at real needs, not imagined needs, and take responsibility for those around us, we are actually making it more possible for everyone to look after themselves. So the social justice slogan about live simply so others may simply live brings us really into that third ethic of fair share. And that's in a way the most complex of the three ethics, because it involves notions of limits, the limits to consumption and the limits to reproduction. How many people can the earth support? How many people can any place support in real terms? That there are limits to everything. And we must recognise and consider those limits even if we don't know exactly what they are. We must consider them all the time. But at the same time, there's the awareness about the abundance of nature. And the abundance of nature is what gives us the confidence to give away surplus. Beyond our circle of reciprocity, beyond one's kin and community, which is awareness about, oh, but they'll do something for us later on. giving away beyond that with no expectation of getting something back, because one has that sense that nature is providing. So a sense of abundance and an awareness of limits, which actually looks like a contradiction, a paradox, and it is. And that's what's good about it, because it brings you back to thinking about it all the time. There's no answer to it. And that's the purpose of an ethic, requiring you to think, not that there's an answer. Because as soon as you've got the answer and you've got it packed away, then you don't have to worry about it anymore, and you don't have to revisit it, and you're heading into the problem territory again. Whereas when you are constantly dealing with these issues, constantly reviewing them, well, is this care of the earth, care of people, and is it fair share? That's the way I would see permaculture ethics. The attraction of permaculture in the late 1970s, especially amongst young people, my peers then, as I was only in my early 20s, was that it was applying environmental thinking to how to create the world we wanted rather than fight against the world we didn't. And that was something that both myself and Bil Mollisson, accepting that he was a generation older than me, both of us had already, in our different ways, come to the conclusion that oppositional environmentalism was really a limited project about trying to stop the world we didn't want, and that we had to create the world we did want. And I think that was primarily what was inspirational to other people, and has remained so throughout this time, because if you look at that dilemma between the stopping the world we don't want and creating the world we do want, there are those two sides in environmental activism, but the general application of the positive side has been, well, you've got to work within the corporate system with government policies at this very large scale level. So there's this enormous sense of compromise and contradiction, and they're the realities that you must deal with. Whereas permaculture was saying, no, do it here now, starting at the bottom with ourselves, with providing our immediate needs, and that being a model for larger community and network growth from the bottom up. So it could be extremely radical, but very positive. So I think that perhaps has persisted over time, but of course there's also the downside of the motivational, inspirational stuff about permaculture, that we can live as part of a natural system without the contradictions of exploitation or alternatively failing to provide for our needs. And some aspects of permaculture, I suppose, have been oversold. The idea of lying under the grapevine, the self-organising system where everything works itself. And especially modern people used to very sedentary lifestyles sometimes get a shock about what's actually involved in working with natural systems, and that it's not maybe as easy as they imagined. So there's always been that tension in permaculture education between the inspiring people to make a start and get active, and all the evidence about, well, you need to know about this or be aware of this trap or whatever. And there are problems with pursuing both those strategies. And in the early years I used to be quite critical of the way Bil Mollisson tended to sell grand the image. And obviously there's a lot of mistakes and collateral damage from that process. People who go out and try something and then reach the first difficult obstacle and say, well, that was all a load of rubbish, that didn't work. So many people became inoculated against permaculture because early examples they saw of it or things they tried to do didn't work. even though the idea may have been sound, but the actual implementation was actually more complicated. And I tended to respond to that with, well, I would lay all the cards on the table, tell everyone about everything I knew about something. But what I found was that sometimes people would go, oh, it's very complicated, isn't it? I'm not sure that I could do that. So that different people need different messages, and at different stages of people's lives they need different messages. So there's, you know, it's been a roller coaster, I suppose, over time of the successes and failures and strengths and weaknesses of permaculture. But that's true of any movement that tries to change society in a fairly substantial way. Well, the ecological crisis, of course, in its widest sense of being an energy, environment and design of industrial civilization crisis that we are in, was one of the fundamental drivers in the creation of permaculture over 30 years ago. And we saw that it required that we redesigned everything we did. Now, to do that, we can't just change a technology here or change a practice there. We actually have to go back to first principles, back to the drawing board. And that's why permaculture design principles are so critical to developing the thinking needed to get past the thinking that created the industrial civilization that we're in, because that civilization is coming to an end, by hook or by crook, over time, through generations. That one is coming to an end because it was built on free, non-renewable energy. And the characteristics of a world reflect the underlying energy in the same way that every ecosystem is determined to a large extent in its structure and its basic characteristics by the nature and concentration of its energy sources. So as we move from a world of abundant non-renewable energy to limited and cyclical renewable energy from nature, we have to change everything we do. And if we actually look at permaculture principles, they are the things we have to do. So permaculture at that level is a much deeper framework for what today is called sustainability. And we believe that that is still the best thinking framework out there. But it's not just a thinking framework that is sitting isolated in academia in the heads of a few people. It's actually got out there down and dirty in the world over the last 30 years. You know, everywhere from the richest countries in the world like Scandinavia and USA and Australia through to some of the poorest countries in the world, in many different social and environmental contexts. So it's a bit tested in that sense. Now, I'm not suggesting that permaculture can easily sort of be the magic wand that makes this very deep systemic crisis go away, because it's really not a problem that can be solved in the conventional sense. We are moving into a world which will be so different from the one we've come from that it's like a death process. It's got to be a death and rebirth process. Now, whether that happens through a series of catastrophes or through more gradual evolutionary processes remains to be seen. But certainly a lot of activists around the world see that now crisis and collapse to some degree or other is an almost inevitable part of that process. And again, permaculture, because of its decentralised, bottom-up, simple things, behavioural design changes that don't require complex organisational, centralised, globalised systems to work, is part of this resilience that enables us to work with the flow, go with the flow of this change. And of course that's influencing movements that are emerging, like the Transition Towns movement, has come out of permaculture activism, and specifically looking at how do we move into a world where there is actually less energy and resources per person on the planet, effectively every year, less and less, and how do we reconfigure that as a positive process that can be transformative in a good sense rather than just a death process. But we are going down that pathway whether we like it or not, so we may as well work out how to make it a positive pathway, and permaculture design principles as thinking tools are part of the enabling tools to allow us to do that.